Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar sponsored by the Global Heat Reduction Initiative. My name is Hana Kajimura, and I'm the CEO of Trellis. And I'm excited to welcome you all today and host this conversation. I'll start with a brief overview of the topic. But then we will turn it over to the experts to go into any sort of detail here. But today we're talking about global heat reduction. We talk incessantly in this space about measuring and minimizing carbon dioxide equivalent emissions, but super pollutants like methane and black carbon and HFCs drive nearly half of global warming, yet we don't spend much time at all talking about them. So in this webinar, we're introducing the concept of total climate accounting, which is an approach that allows us to expand beyond CO2 and look at heat holistically so that companies and governments can create a portfolio approach to addressing carbon longer term and super pollutants in the near term. So joining me today on this webinar are some experts on the topic. We have Dr. Katie Kaku, who is the Senior Technical Director at the Global Heat Reduction Initiative. We have Jennifer Norfolk, who is the Senior Director of Partnerships, and we have Kif Gallagher, who is the Executive Director. And to kick us off and tell us a little bit more about this, I'll turn it over to you, Kif.
Great. Thank you, Hannah. Thanks for hosting and for your introduction. I'll just add kind of reduce that summary of what you're about to hear down to a couple important ideas, two big problems. One is the climate challenge that we face today, which is how do we slow the rate of warming to avoid the most catastrophic outcomes of climate change between now and 2050, when decarbonization is supposed to kick in. The second is a corporate challenge, or more broadly, an organizational challenge, which is in a time of limited budgets, in a time where most of us will acknowledge that we're not going to meet our near-term targets, and many of us are acknowledging we're not going to meet our longer-term targets. How do we address this climate problem in a way that fits within our current schemes and provides us the greatest return on the climate dollar spent? So I hope if you get anything out of this today from our team, is that you get a better handle on what that problem is and what you can do about it within your current thinking and without too much disruption. So let's go. So to reiterate what Hannah just said, many of you may already be familiar, and super pollutants are gaining quite a bit of traction with this cool graphic from CCAC, which really on the right, which really lays out what Hannah just said, which is, but a lot of people still don't know that roughly half of warming is not driven by carbon dioxide, but instead by short-lived climate forcers, short-lived climate pollutants, or more recently called, and it's catching on, super pollutants. We'll talk more about what makes them super in a minute. But 50% of warming is caused by that, even much more in the very near term, the critical next couple of decades. But only 5% of global climate finance, that is corporate mitigation investments, government mitigation investments, are actually going to address these specifically. Why is that? Oops. Because the current metric, or the common metric for carbon accounting, CO2e, which is carbon equivalents, carbon dioxide equivalents, over global warming potential 100, that is, it's the equivalent impact of all the greenhouse gases over a 100-year period. I don't think there's anyone on this call that thinks that we have 100 years, and yet there may be very few of us on this call that aren't working within a context that is actually targeting 100 years. We need to target the next 25 years. And to do that, as I just said, we've got to focus on these super pollutants. And the problem with the 100-year model is that it undervalues the greenhouse gases that also fall under the super pollutant category. You look at methane, as Hannah just said, and HFCs, and their time in the atmosphere is only 10 to 14 years. And yet they are orders of magnitude more potent than CO2 while they're in the atmosphere. Methane, for instance, is up, 150 times. HFCs, depending on which one you're looking at, can be, thousands of times. And then, so that's for greenhouse gases that are the most super polluting gases. There's nitrous oxide is longer lived, but let's not get too technical. The other key piece is that there are heat drivers that are super pollutants that aren't greenhouse gases at all, and they completely overlooked by the current model. Hannah, you mentioned black carbon. That comes from combustion, open burning, and fossil fuel production, and I mean combustion and other things. But it's responsible for the soot in the air. And low-level ozone, also known as tropospheric ozone, is a precursor to the smog that hazes over our cities. Massive implications, both of these, as well as methane and others, around air quality, which is a really big problem. But from a heat perspective, these are only in the atmosphere for days, but they are, black carbon up to 52,000 times, more than 50,000 times more potent as a heat driver. Well, it's only for days, so then it goes down, but no, it doesn't, because we keep burning it. So it's just sitting there like a hot blanket, circling the atmosphere. Same with low-level ozone, days to weeks, but much more potent. So if we the only way to limit global warming to the Paris commitment of 1.5, or at least less than 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial eras, we actually need to focus on both. Now, if you just focused on super pollutants alone, or at least the short-lived climate pollutants, then you would, you're looking at a 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius metric. You could avoid up to 0.6 degrees Celsius just focusing on those. That's a pretty darn good bang for your buck. But the fact is that to get to our collective global objective, we need to be focused on both. So we're definitely not minimizing the importance of drawing down that carbon over the long term. That's critical. But to actually get to decarbonization, we have to focus between now and 2050. We have to focus on both. And you can see business as usual, that top line puts us above 3 degrees, and all hell breaks loose at that point. And well before that, actually. So what are we doing? In 2015, basically the whole world signed up to this Paris Agreement that I've been referencing, with that temperature and time-bound objective. And since then, you've had various standards. I mentioned 10,000 plus businesses here. That's using the SBTI. I know there's other standards where companies and organizations are tracking, using to drive their strategies. Really hard to target a 2050 objective with a 100-year metric. On its face, it's just you're not totally doing it. So it's becoming more of a scientific consensus, and there's more and more efforts being made to make people aware that we really need both a near-term and a long-term objective, and we've got to have a model that enables us to track that in corporations and organizations specifically to do so. So as I just mentioned, the good news is that really, I mean, so recently, I mean, in just the last several months, there has been a lot of great NGOs and the media and philanthropies. And if you are a little bit of a geek on this, you might notice on LinkedIn, there's more and more. I think last Climate Week in New York, there were a couple things focused on methane, and that's certainly been a key issue, since since the last couple COPs, and a lot of people have been talking about this. But there's been a real uptake in the broader understanding around super pollutants. That's just one article, the Bloomberg one up top. This is one group that's exciting. That is a group of philanthropies really trying to accelerate the awareness and the investment around addressing these. And probably most important is that the IPCC itself has said that they're going to be coming down in 2027 when their next assessment report is going to be published with guidance on how to measure super pollutants and short-lived climate forces. So we can expect that the big standards that are under revision right now, the biggest probably being the greenhouse gas protocol, and then all that follow kind of from their direction, are going to be looking for ways to address this bigger problem. Is what do we do about the next couple of decades? So as Hannah said, what we are offering is a more holistic approach to climate accounting that covers all heat drivers, not just the greenhouse gases, but also the aerosols, and allows you to measure their impact in terms of heat, which is really the goal here, in both the near and long term. So, what path are we on right now? You saw that north of 3 degrees right here under 2.6 degree scenario, that global GDP, by the year 2049, as we head to 2050, will be reduced by 38 trillion a year. That's livelihoods. That's pure economics. Health-wise, I mentioned air pollution earlier. 3.2 million premature deaths annually right now are linked to household air pollution. Environmental damage, we read about it every day. Most of the people on this call, are very aware of it. Just putting one here around rising sea levels, the destroying coastal infrastructure and ecosystems. Think coral reefs, think mangroves, but also think whole cities, whole infrastructures of people who then become displaced. And that brings us to geopolitical risk, from extreme heat, from your city disappearing, and other factors causing displacement and significant migration, even here in the United States in the not too distant future, between now and 2050, believe it or not, this rate. So what do we call it? We call it total climate accounting. And it's according to Dr. Drew Shindell at Duke University, who chairs the Climate and Clean Air Coalition's scientific advisory panel. The Climate and Clean Air Coalition has been all over this. They really have been leading the charge on superpollutants for many years. And they are a United Nations Environment Program convened government and non-state actor intergovernmental organization with hundreds of members, that reviewed the protocol upon which this is based, which is a practical application of the latest consensus findings from the IPCC, and it's backed by credible science, peer-reviewed science. Again, what we call CO2e plus allows you not to abandon the CO2e, which I think is going to be hard to move the world off that, but provides additional critical actionable data, related to all the heat drivers, as I said, greenhouse gases and super pollutants. And it converts that information into heat so that organizations and governments can actually get on track with our objective, which, yes, is emissions reduction, but it's emissions reduction so that we can slow the rate of warming. And we've got to not forget to talk about extreme heat. The two biggest environmental killers, extreme heat and pollution. And to address both of them, we do the same thing, which is we target these super pollutants. And through CO2e plus, you can align these structures, your measurement with your near-term timeframes and not just the long-term goal. So in short, it's sort of short, I got 5 points as to why we should do this now. Again, from the organizational perspective, to maximize return on investment as you pursue your near-term targets by prioritizing interventions with the greatest climate return per dollar spent. Okay. The second is a lot of you are looking at scope 3 and supply chain emissions and transition planning, risks and opportunities there. How in our industry can we focus on these particular interventions that target these super pollutants? Focusing on these near-term horizons that align not only with your standard, if it's SBTI milestones in the near term, but also the country planning timeframes, and as we've been discussing, the 2050 net zero objective. Given that the IPCC is coming down with guidance, you can get on this now and get ahead of it and future-proof your climate strategy with this more holistic approach. And you can, believe it or not, deliver immediate local benefits, including air quality, reduced heat exposure, and food and water security And more companies, as they look at the risk factors within their supply chain, within their infrastructure, within their workforces, are wondering, is there anything we can do other than cooling centers and sprinkler systems, to address this? And yes, this is longer term, but it's actually something you can do within your existing climate strategy, which is to target these pollutants. I'm going to hand it off in a minute, and we will share. Jennifer will share how we bring this total climate lens for strategic action across a few of our products, and also get a little bit more into what we mean by converting it into heat, so you can kind of get a deeper look at that.
Cool. Thanks, Kif. Before we get too deep here, I wanted to pause for a second and just ask a few clarifying questions. For the rest of you tuning in today, we're going to have time for Q&A from the audience at the end. So if you have questions as we go, please drop them into that Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. But to start, so I think you just laid out a really compelling case for all of this, and at the same time, organizations like really have their hands full just trying to wrap their head around CO2. What is like the single most compelling reason why somebody should take this approach?
I mean, you put me, I could pretend to be a climate scientist. As a human being, it's to slow the rate of warming. As an organization, it's to do that, but do it with the greatest return on climate dollar spent. And I think of those five, that's really the most important thing. I think that's the big challenge for companies. How do we accelerate our impact? We don't have enough resources to do everything, but we can do this, and we can integrate it into our strategy. Now, doesn't require fancy new technology, doesn't require anything other than getting additional actionable data. So best ROI.
Yeah, okay, that's great to hear. That doesn't require too much new, fancy, complicated tools. Why do you think it hasn't been more widely adopted yet or talking about, given that the TCA approach does seem to offer more of a complete picture?
Well, I'll give you my answer for that. Everybody's welcome to opine. I think it just comes from, a mix of, universities have like a tech transfer office, and that's to take a technology out of the lab and bring it into practical application. And you have in pharmaceutical, I mean, you have it across technologies, right? I could be wrong, but I don't think IPCC has a tech transfer office. What's interesting is that from the very earliest reports, they've been talking about heat. They talk about it in terms of radiative forcing, but they've been talking. This is the same terminology effectively. So this isn't new science. It's been known, but it's been known within a small circle, and it hasn't really gotten into the bloodstream. And then I think you could add the fact that you get used to something, you develop standards, and those take a long time to get understood and adopted, and you just kind of start going. But I think what people have realized is it's not working. Some people say, put the emergency brake on. This is super pollutant is the way to do it. It's also like, we got to put the brake on the current model. Like it's one critical piece of the story. It's not the whole story. So I think it's a mix of things. That's my perspective.
Yeah, that makes sense. So how do we move it forward? What do you think are the steps to gaining more adoption, and how would you recommend that companies start to implement this?
It's, as I said, no fancy technologies. It's not too difficult. I mean, right now we can help with converting your existing, and Jennifer's going to talk about this more, your existing inventory into heat knowledge. Like what is this? What are the impacts here, and where are the points within my set of mitigation investment opportunities? Am I greening my roof? Am I electrifying my fleet? Am I going deeper with suppliers? Am I doing all the above? What's the return going to be in terms of slowing the rate of warming faster? So I think it's getting that information, and maybe you don't measure your black carbon. You probably don't right now, but for some companies, that's a huge thing that is part of their emissions. And frankly, they're not getting credit for how that's, increasing air quality and slowing the rate of local warming. So you want that data. You don't have to make it public, but you want that data so that you can then make a more informed mitigation decision. It's just a question of Working slowly if you want, but getting to the point where it's like any investment situation. You want more data to make the most informed investment, and you can do it, and we can help you with that. You'll learn more in a minute.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Well, it would be great to have a specific example we could latch onto to bring this into real life.
Fair enough. Jennifer will give you that. So we'll have that. That's coming up. Good question.
Perfect. I think we can pop the slides back up.
Okay.
And Jennifer, take it away.
Great. Thank you, Hannah and Kip. All right, so we're going to get into the how we do this a little bit now. So I'm going to talk about our total climate footprint, which is basically everything you get in your existing carbon footprint and CO2e and what we call CO2e plus. You get all of this additional data that lets you focus more on the heat impact in the near term. So that includes your black carbon, your ozone precursors that lead to smog, and importantly, we're able to analyze this over any time frame, because as Kip illustrated, these different emissions and pollutants, they work on different timelines. They have different atmospheric lives. And so they have an impact on heat on different terms, not just the GWP 100 that CO2e is based on. So we can break that down by different time periods that actually matter for your corporate planning timeframes. And additionally, as Kif mentioned, these have huge health and air quality impacts. And so we're able to take that data and quantify your contributions to your sustainable development goals as well. So we call that our total climate footprint. So it's everything in your existing carbon footprint and all of this additional information to give you a more holistic understanding of your emissions. So one example of this is for a recent client that we worked with, Napa Recycling and Waste Services out in California. As you know, California has some really ambitious climate goals. They have specific goals toward 2030. So in the near term, not 100 years out, but in 2030, they want to really be focused on net zero. And so we worked with them to quantify their emissions associated with their existing operations and then help them plan. They were looking at a couple different big mitigation investments to try and meet these goals. And they wanted to understand how to achieve those targets and what would have the biggest impact between now and 2030. And so we demonstrated to them their heat profile in the near term and looked at a couple different strategies for how to give them the biggest bang for their climate dollar. And as it turned out, it made that they were looking at a few different options, and our analysis definitely tipped the scales towards one that was going to have a huge impact on their methane emissions in the near term, focusing them more on composting operations rather than fleet electrification. So to kind of get into some data, on the left, you will see what a typical carbon footprint looks like. You know, you have a lot of CO2, some methane, and we've extrapolated some black carbon based on the CO2 to illustrate the point here. But it's all kind of in one big lump. You can distinguish which one's which, but it doesn't really give you any actionable insights. We take that data and produce what we call our heat impact data. You can see a lot more nuance and a lot more detail about which levers you can pull over different time frames. So in the 2024 data that we're illustrating here, the little bit of black carbon is driving as much heat as the CO2 and as the methane. And over time, in the near term, between now and 2050, you see methane has a really outsized imprint on heat versus the CO2. And so depending on your corporate timeframes and your different goals, our analysis allows you to understand and take action where it's going to have the biggest impact towards the mitigation activities that you're trying to affect. So now I'm going to give you a couple examples here, a little more specific. So here's two different projects that a company could undertake. Both will reduce 1,000 tons of CO2e, but they have very different heat impacts between now and 2050. The reforestation project, which largely reduces CO2, will have the full impact by 21-23, whereas a project focused on organic waste will have a much bigger impact on heat in the near term because it's more focused on methane, which is a near-term heat driver. All right, so that's kind of the footprint and the kind of analysis and advisory services that we can use that footprint to drive better climate decisions or more nuanced climate decisions. We also have a registry in the voluntary carbon market, and we provide credits, basically with the same mentality, CO2e plus. It's the same transaction of CO2e as every other registry, and we offer this additional data on timelines of heat and the different heat drivers that are involved with those projects. So this is a state-of-the-art registry. We are powered by Eco Registry, which does wonderful work on a lot of the major exchanges out there. Through this registry, you're able to buy credits, handle offtake agreements, and also get into the beyond value chain investments that I know a lot of folks that are struggling with SBTI commitments are working towards. As I mentioned, all the transactions are in tons of CO2e, just like every other registry, and you get this additional heat data over time. And you can see that a different analysis over the different timeframes that may matter to you. Additionally, we also quantify the co-benefits so that you can make credible claims around your sustainable development goals. So again, here are a couple different examples of 1,000 tons of CO2e in a carbon credit program. All of these are 1,000 tons. They have the same impact over 100 years. But between now and 2050, the projects that have more of a focus are on methane, such as a waste management project that is working on organic waste, it's going to have a much bigger implication on heat reduction than projects that are more focused on CO2. And so to get into more of the methodologies on our registry, I will invite Dr. Katie Kaku to help describe some of that for us. Thank you,
Thanks,
Katie.
Jennifer. Thanks, Jennifer. So we do currently have 4 methodologies living on our registry. They all have a focus on super pollutant and near-term heat reductions. 3 of them have a focus on reducing methane emissions, and one focuses on the reduction and collection and destruction of HFCs. I also want to bring to your attention that we have a methodology out for public consultation. This is a methodology for assessing emission reductions for rice cultivation. We do invite public comment on this, but unique within our registry is that we are able to offer credits for black carbon emission reductions too. It's important to state that all of the credits are offered in tons carbon dioxide equivalents in order to mesh with the current voluntary carbon market status, including the black carbon emission reductions. But we do also provide information on each credit reduced for the near-term heat warming as well as long-term heat warming.
All right, thank you both. Now I have a few questions about this, and then we'll open it up to audience question and answer. And we're tracking some great questions in there already, so keep submitting via that Q&A button at the bottom. But just a follow up for you, Dr. Kaku, on this piece about methodology. How did you kind of make sense of this landscape and decide what to pursue first? And does that suggest anything about your priorities?
Oh, absolutely. Thanks, Hannah. All of our methodologies were chosen with to emphasize near-term heat reductions, and so therefore all of our methodologies are revolve around super pollutant reductions. We also, as I said, unique to the market, we are able to offer black carbon emission reduction credits because we believe this is a very important driver of near-term heat that is currently unaddressed in the voluntary carbon market. We did do some market research analysis to ensure that our methodologies do meet current market demand for voluntary for credits on the market. And finally, all of our methodologies underwent a rigorous review process, both internally and externally. We drew in experts from a number of different sectors, including NGOs and academics, just to ensure that our methodology was the most rigorous and thorough and credible on the market.
Okay, got it. So one question I have about all of this, there's this ecosystem can get really complicated in terms of different people playing different roles. I know that SCS, which is the broader organization you're a part of, is a verifier, and you're hosting these projects in the voluntary carbon market. Would you also be a verifier in this heat registry?
Jennifer?
Sure, I'll take that one. Yeah, it's a great question and really important clarification. Yeah, SES has been a trusted validation and verification body in the voluntary carbon market for many years. And with that, we take that trust very seriously. And so this registry, which is also hosted by SES, has its own VBBs. We don't validate and verify our own credits. We use outside third parties for that.
Okay, got it. That makes sense. I'm looking at a few questions that maybe are relevant to what we were just talking about around methodology. Somebody asked, do you accept requests for new methodology categories?
Wait, so the question is, are we open to new methodology categories?
Yes.
We are, yeah. Like other registries, we have a system for review of outside methodologies, depending on how applicable it is to the priorities that Dr. Kaku just laid out. Our resources, how much time and effort it'll take. You know, there's a pricing chart that you can find on the registry that will tell you kind of how that works. But there's a level where we're just getting feedback. There's a level where, you know, we won't take it at all. There's a level where we have to do a lot of work. It's also, we have this unique protocol that is our registry standard, that our registry standard is based on. And so that's critical, and that has to do, without getting too technical, basically the heat impact or the radiative forcing components. There's a lot of equations that go in there. So there's some complexity, as there are, I know, with all methodologies and other registries as well, standards. So yeah, we kind of take those on a case-by-case basis.
Okay, got it. So it sounds like, yes, open to other methodologies, but a lot of thought has gone into selecting the ones that you've worked on now. Another question here is, if heat is so important and thinking about, I mean, it's global warming after all, and thinking about these different time frames, why has the 100-year timeline been the focus this whole time?
I thought that question came up earlier, and I sort of answered it. I don't know if the person was there. Again, I have an opinion on this. Let me add to that, and they can go back and view the videotape. What I would add to what I said is, you know, because you have to draw down carbon dioxide over time. I mean, that's why it survived. Like, we actually have to have that long-term goal. It's critical, and you know, especially when we're seeing with wetlands and other and rainforests and other ecosystemic vehicles for drawing down that carbon are now not only drawing that, but they're in some cases emitting methane. And so the planet is overwhelmed. It's not able to do its job. So 100% we need to lower it over time. And we don't present CO2e plus as an either or. I mean, that's kind of why we went down that path and didn't try to introduce, you know, CO2 FE, which is forcing equivalent, right? And no one's going to start moving to that. It's too difficult. So I think it's critical, but it's not enough, and it's not addressing the critical next couple decades. And so the other part you can go back and look at, but institutional inertia, and, you know, just that I don't think the mechanisms for getting it out of the scientific realm, which is known about this forever, the IPCC, it just hasn't kind of leaped over. And I think there's a number of reasons for that.
Yeah, right. And as time marches on, we're feeling more and more urgency, and our time horizons get shorter and shorter. Um, I also think we've touched on this, but there are a few questions, so I think it's worth restating about how this approach fits in with the voluntary carbon market, how it's similar, different, complementary.
100% complementary. I think, as my colleague said earlier, that the unit of account is still delivered in the CO2e, the carbon dioxide equivalents, and that carbon dioxide equivalence comes with the GWP, global warming potential 100 years. So we could have said it's something else, but we decided let's not try to force feed the world with that. Let's offer something that gives that normal accounting metric, the basis of trade and of the unit of account right now, but just add critical data to it, and that's that plus. And so it's not difficult to add that information. It's almost like another column that you can add to your current inventory and your mitigation investment strategies as you look at them and what impacts they'll have. And with that comes verified claims about not just emissions reduction, but heat reduction. And so it enables a corporation, a city that's grappling with this and looking at different infrastructure investments they might make, to think not about just the CO2e GWP 100 emission reduction, but also where are we most likely to get the best bang for our buck for actually slowing the rate of warming, and what are those effects going to be, and converting it into heat. So it's pretty much just adding heat over any time frame, not just 100-year, to your existing model. So it's not disruptive. It's not meant to replace. It's meant to sort of support and complement the current model.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And what about specifically with the GHG protocol? Like, do you think that that will evolve to include this more holistic approach?
Personally, yes, I do, but there's 300 people on the call, and they may have different opinions. There may even be folks from who are part of that revision process underway. I can tell you, I think they've been pretty transparent. They are looking at how to integrate. They're considering how they're looking at how to consider this broader set of inputs that drive warming, and they're also looking at how do we address what I opened up with, this climate challenge of the next couple of decades and not the 100-year model, where that lands and where sort of SBTI lands. I mean, you asked why hasn't this been adopted earlier? I mean, a great impetus for wide-scale adoption obviously would be for these standards to that are widely followed to integrate this. We only have so much control over that, which is very little. But I'm pretty certain that these issues are being considered in the revision processes underway.
Yeah. Which like gets to one of your original reasons for why companies should do this, is to help stay ahead of evolving standards. And I think that seems to be, I mean, why companies do any of this. Like, A, it's certainly because we all care about climate change and we want to do what we can to mitigate against it, but also companies want to be able to talk about this and get credit for it. And the way that they do that is if it is accepted by these standards.
True. And I think the IPCC guidance that's coming down just around the corner in 2027 will add some fire to that necessity for standards to incorporate in one way or another.
Yeah. There's another question here, which I think we have touched on, but I'm just going to read it for you. Why was there a need to create new methodologies? Did existing markets not already have similar methodologies, or was there a specific gap to be filled?
I think we have touched on that, but Katie, Dr. Kaku, do you mind just talking about that a little bit?
Absolutely. So, I mean, we do want to acknowledge the amount of work that's been put into the existing voluntary carbon market, and all of our methodologies have been based on the rigorous science and review process that they have already done. But we didn't think that they fully addressed all of the near-term climate heat drivers. And in order to expand existing methodologies to ensure that the focus was on super pollutants and near-term warming reductions, we had to both add our unique radiative forcing calculations to what was there, so we could calculate the near-term heat benefits of this, and also if there was a black carbon emissions, which many of these methodologies have but are currently not counted for, if there were black carbon emissions, we wanted to make sure that we were giving project proponents credits for any black carbon emission reductions that might occur within these methodologies.
Makes sense. This is a related question, I think, tangentially to that, but do the GHR protocols that you're talking about address black carbon due to wildfires and control burns?
So within the methodologies we currently have on our registry, there isn't any place to incorporate wildfires, fires or control burns, but the one that is currently open for public comment, the rice methane methodology, there is a place to address agricultural burning and any potential reductions around agricultural burning. So yes, within that methodology, there is black carbon emission reduction credits.
Okay, cool. Um, well, those are the questions that I have in the Q&A right now. If there are any last questions from the audience, please get those in. I think there's an interesting comment in the chat right now, just going back to like why have we been anchored on the 100-year time frame that Linda put in here. It was adopted in the mid 1990s to understand the long-term implications of CO2. Um, but even in that time, they kind of acknowledged that it was maybe the best thing that we had, but wasn't perfect. And as we talked about, it is just continuing to sink in how how little time that we have and how quickly climate impacts would start to really be felt and to accelerate um, as we go, that this is not a linear situation. But was just curious if Kif or anyone else wanted to react to that.
I can, but Jennifer, are you motivated? You don't have to. I could take it. Go ahead. Yeah, I mean, first of all, welcome, Linda. The Global Heat Reduction Initiative is part of SCS Global Services. And Linda is a co-founder of SCS Global Services and has also is SVP there, but has been a really close advisor to us in developing this business. So thanks for, I'm not watching the chat, but it sounds like you got in the mix there, and that's really helpful. Yeah, I mean, I think, look, it's getting hot. I mean, there's the other piece we haven't talked about is like the Western world, that ends up, driving a lot of things in this planet. On the not so great side, are like they can't go out in the summertime anymore, and they can't go, so it's like I live in DC. I mean, I don't know how many days the first part of the summer, I think it was north of 20 days that wasn't advisable to leave your house. And honestly, it wasn't like that 5 years ago. And you don't have to go back to my childhood. So I think there's just that. And then of course, yes, somebody mentioned wildfires, the just destruction and massive response from Mother Nature that's happening right now, I think is just scaring people, as they should be. And I gave some of those stats around, the various components of economic instability and geopolitical risk, and of course, the environmental damage that's happening right now. So I think sometimes you need a little kick in the butt, and necessity is the mother of invention. I think that's as much a part of it as the other things that we've already kind of put on the table.
Yeah. Yeah, makes a ton of sense. So if I am a company and I'm convinced of this approach and I'm trying to figure out what it means for me, it sounds like there are two main things that we've talked about today. One is consider looking at super pollutants holistically, not just CO2 when you go to do your greenhouse gas inventory. Make sure these other things like methane are included in that approach so that you are getting this total picture of heat and not just CO2. And then secondly is as I go to participate in the voluntary carbon market or purchase credits against my emissions, that I should also consider and look at projects that are targeting some of these super pollutants, because that will not just get me the CO2 equivalent reduction, but also target heat over a shorter time frame, and that is really what we're after. Did I get that right? Anything you would change?
Yeah, you did. Let me just add a little bit to that. one clarification. When you do your GHG inventory, which most companies do, their so-called carbon footprint, they are incorporating methane. It's in there. It's just that it's minimized in terms of its impact and their understanding of what it's like. What's the value of the data I'm getting? I'm about to make a bunch of investments. I want the best data possible to make the most informed mitigation investment choices. And with that limited amount of data, first of all, often it's done by a consulting firm and the company hasn't asked for, the firm doesn't provide them, and they don't even know to get the information disaggregated. So first of all, did you get the methane read in specifically? It's definitely in the CO2e mix that you got. So that's just a point of clarification. What's missing are these aerosols specifically. And then, yes, you should be targeting superpollutants. We're not the only ones talking about that. You're hearing more and more, there's a couple of the biggest registries now have they characterize projects that mitigate superpollutants now as instead of just a methane project, they're filing it under their superpollutant solution. And that's great. The difference with us is that they're not getting that heat reading they're not able to allow carbon credit investors to compare credits with respect to, they can say, oh, well, look, I got it under a super pollutant column here. And that's good. And maybe it's having the same effect. It's just not informing my investment decision and it's limiting the claims I can make. Like I want to lower the rate of warming, slow the rate of warming while I'm on my net zero path. Okay, not just a net zero path, but a slow the rate of warming path on the way. And the data that you get from this protocol enables you to do that, both across our registry and then the reading that you get from our total climate footprint and advisory services.
Yes. Okay. Makes total sense. And those are great clarifications. Yeah, I've been in the position of leading a corporate sustainability team and doing many carbon footprints. And it's true, like all of these, like a methane would just be put in terms of CO2. And what you're saying is it's really worth looking at these pollutants in their own right because they actually have different effects in the atmosphere. And I really love what you said about slow the rate of warming while you're on your net zero path. So it's kind of adding this additional lens of I still have my net zero goals. I'm still trying to minimize CO2, but while I do that, I'm also having the greatest impact I can have on heat reduction.
Yeah, I'll just add one thing. Say you're on the project side of the equation. I saw on the list of attendees, there's a couple well-known projects that are kind of all over the super pollutant business. They're trying to figure out what registry they should be working with. And we respect our colleagues everywhere on this. I think with respect to claims, should there be a marginal sort of value increase, right? A premium to slow the rate of warming now versus slow it in 100 years, right? On a net present value basis, based on the death and destruction we're seeing everywhere, we think the answer is yes. So those credits that are associated with super pollutant mitigation can also make the claim that they are reducing heat by this much over these near-term timeframes using the same protocol. So it's kind of both sides. When we're talking about the voluntary carbon market, it's really both sides of the market you're adding value to, I think. On the corporate claim, where there, as you mentioned at the very top of the call, creating a portfolio, yes, there's reason to protect nature and do forestry-based projects. 100%. It does a whole bunch of things that go beyond carbon equivalents, right? And there's a reason to invest part of our portfolio in carbon direct removal. And we're willing to make those investments in some of those technologies and some of those nature-based ones. Okay, but we also want to focus on addressing the near-term heat, the accelerating near-term heat crisis. And we can do it with this portion of our portfolio. And if you're thinking in that way, then we hope you'll talk to us and reach out to us.
Cool. Great. We did have one more question in the chat that says, as for additional data that we should need to start gathering, what would you recommend us to focus on?
Katie, please.
Absolutely. So the great thing about the total climate accounting is it can be built upon using the information you provide to calculate your existing carbon footprint. So all the data you provide to someone to calculate your carbon footprint is also used to calculate your heat impact and your black carbon emissions. When we've put this into practice, the only difference we've found, the only additional data we've needed is in order to fully get the most accurate estimate of black carbon, sometimes we need some additional information around emission control measure, but there is no additional work or very little additional work on the client side to get this additional valuable piece of information.
Okay, cool. That is great news. One more question. Does GHR account for albedo and cooling aerosols?
We do account for cooling aerosols. We'd love to have a great discussion with you about that, but our current model does have that within its calculation abilities. Albedo is our next big project. That's a great question. We think albedo is a currently undervalued way to help mitigate global warming and localized heat impact. There are a lot of great science on it. There's a lot of great possible applications. There's a little bit of a bridge that needs to be overcome, but it's a project that we're very eager to get started on as soon as possible.
Can you just tell the world what albedo is? I don't know if everybody knows
So
that.
albedo is surface reflectivity. So basically the materials you use to cover your roof or asphalt parking lots, all of that has the ability to either reflect sunlight back into space or absorb it and release it as heat. Albedo or surface reflectivity is a huge driver of urban heat island effect, which I know many on this webinar are well aware of. The darker the material you use, the more likely that sunlight is to get absorbed and re-released as heat, which could drive localized warming. But it also contributes to climate change by heating up the atmosphere in a very tangible way.
Yeah. So that was going to be my question to take us home, which maybe that's what you had in mind, but now that you've introduced this approach and the TCA footprint, what are the next big priorities? It sounds like albedo is one.
Yeah, albedo is definitely one. There's groups that both Katie and Jennifer have been working on for a while. We thought that we were close to accelerating the work to a usable standard that could then, what's interesting, as Katie said about the heat island effect, like that's not lost on mayors. Like all the climate mayors know that. A lot of them are implementing strategies, cooling strategies, local cooling strategies, using reflective surfaces. What's interesting to us is they're not, that's not being counted against their 2050 goal. They're just doing it because it works. But imagine if you had a standard that would enable sort of a carbon equivalence, if you will, when it comes to the heat lens, right? Because it's very, very powerful, as Dr. Kaku said. So that's something we're very interested in. I think just more immediately, it's, finishing and sharing this heat conversion calculator in an automated format that will enable us to scale this, make it a lot easier for companies to do what Katie just said, and have us help them and do those calculations for them so that we can scale this work. And other innovations in the pipeline that are very much focused on slowing the rate of warming between now and 2050, which we think is the great challenge before the planet right now. So
Yeah.
More to come.
Cool. Well, it seems like we've hit a nerve with this topic of albedo, which I agree, like we're kind of moving from CO2 to heat to versions, like further and further versions of that, which I think is great progress and shows how this conversation is really developing. So thank you for being on the leading edge of all of that. And I'm sure there are lots of follow-ups from today and folks who would be interested to talk to you and your team. I'm just going to wrap us up here because we're coming close to the top of the hour. Thank you to everyone who showed up today. If you'd like to rewatch the webinar, the recording is going to be archived at trellis.net. So the team, you'll get an email about that. for you to find the link later today. You can also check out all of these resources that are linked here and were linked earlier in the chat. And so things like the slides from today, various articles that were mentioned by Kif and the team along the way, as well as some of the methodologies. So more to come. I know the team would love to talk to you if you have questions, and you'll be getting all of that contact information. So thanks to everyone again for joining and for the lively discussion. And I hope everyone has a great end to the week. See you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.